All right, I think we can get started. Thank you all for joining us. I'm sure more people will tune in as we get started, but I want to respect your time and thank you all for being here. My name is Allison Bender. I am the outreach coordinator at the Wisconsin Energy Institute at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Um, this is the Energy Institute in this picture right here. Even though I'm not here, I'm tuning into you all today from my living room. The Energy Institute is this building, but it's also a network of over 160 researchers who are studying all different things of how to make this transition away from fossil fuels, from microgrids to creating biofuels out of plants like switchgrass and poplar trees. We are located on campus, just a little ways from the Camp Randall Stadium, if you're familiar with Madison at all. Here's the lake, here's the Energy Institute. And I wanted to note that the UW Energy Institute, as well as the entire campus and the libraries, who you'll hear from in a little bit today, are located on traditional Ho-Chunk land. The Ho-Chunk people have lived here since time immemorial, and they call this land Dejop. And it's important to know that the Ho-Chunk Nation and the 11 other First Nations in present-day Wisconsin remain vibrant and strong. And we want to acknowledge that Indigenous peoples are doing some of the most important and leading work in the transition to away from fossil fuels and for clean energy. So I'll pass it over to my colleague Troy, who can introduce himself here.
Thank you, Allison. So as Allison said, my name is Reeves. So I am part of the oral history program, which is part of the UW-Madison Archives. So the top arrow there, we are just fairly close to the Energy Institute. The oral history program is a full-time staff of one, me, and we help to preserve campus history by collecting and curating stories about our campus's past. Since 1971, we've collected over 2,000 oral histories or over 5,000 hours of audio, either on specific campus topics like the Vietnam era protest, or by doing campus life histories, which is interviewing people for several hours about their life and time on campus. We also communicate about not only our oral history collection, but how to do oral history, and we collaborate with people and groups both on and off campus. So this opportunity to talk to you today is a way to do both of those last points, both communicate and collect. So thank you, Allison, for giving me the opportunity to co-present with you today.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here, Troy. We have a lot to get through today in just 45 short minutes. So what we're going to do is introduce the project. What do we mean when we say the Energy Transitions Oral History Project? We're going to give you a little bit of a primer on oral history. What is it? And we're going to also give you a little bit of background and context on what in the world is going on with energy today. After that, we'll go through some steps about how to conduct your own energy transition oral history, and then make space for Q&A. For the teachers out there, I just wanted to note that the steps on how to conduct the oral history project are also available in an activity guide that's published on our website. So no need to stress about taking notes. We are recording this call and we'll share the slides with you as well. So lots of resources for after we're done with our time together today. So what is this project? Obviously, you can tell this is a collaboration between the Energy Institute and the university's oral history program. And our goal is to support you all in going out and becoming oral historians and collecting stories about energy, about renewable energy, about climate change. This project began 2 summers ago with a program called Grandparents University. You can see some of the participants here. The students in the program interviewed their grandparents on these topics, and it worked really well and people enjoyed it. And so we thought, why don't we build this into something bigger? And so I'm really excited because you all will be the biggest cohort of oral historians we've had since then to go out and collect stories. And we're hopeful, our goal for today is that at the end of this, you'll feel like you have the tools and the confidence and what you need to know to be able to go out and conduct your own oral history. So what is oral history? Before we get into it, I just wanted to get you thinking about what history is. Just step back a minute. So if you want to, in the chat, we'd love to hear your answers. You can put it in the chat and their Q&A. What do we mean when we say history? What are we even thinking about? Yeah, I'm seeing some answers. We're thinking about the past. We're thinking about things that happened, past events, stories and accounts and facts. And when we talk about history in school, we often think about it in two different ways. So where do we go when we are going to learn history? Often we think about two big buckets of sources. We think about what we consider primary sources and what we consider secondary sources. Primary sources are those that are first person accounts. They're considered authoritative. They might be like this journal here or a photograph. And secondary sources are those that include synthesis or analysis, or they're grouping together primary sources. And what's really awesome and what Troy's going to tell you is that when we're conducting an oral history, we are in the process of creating a primary source of history. I'll pass it over to you, Troy.
Great, thank you. So as you can see there in the first bullet point, and I'm going to expand on that just a little bit. So oral history is a method of gathering and preserving and interpreting through recorded interviews, as you can see in the third bullet point there, voices and memories of people, communities and participants in past events. So what is the past? Well, the past is anything that's happened from a second ago backward. One of the great things about doing oral history is you can do oral history with people who have lived 75, 85, 95 years ago, depending on who you interview or how old they are. But you can also do oral history on current events with people, at the age of a student or the age of a college student. It really allows us to be able to not just focus on a couple of generations ago, although we certainly should, but also focus on recent events. As you can see there, it's based on storytelling and listening. So, and really, I would probably flip those. I mean, to be a good oral historian is to be a good listener. Nobody ever explained to me how to be a good listener, but I usually tell people that listening is an activity that involves not only your ears, but your brain, your eyes, if you are able to have eye contact with the person you're interviewing, and then also your heart. So it's based on listening, and it's based on listening to people who do then tell you stories about their past. Anecdotes is another word for story about their past. And this is, you need to have some type of recording device to do oral history. This isn't just taking notes. This isn't just trying to remember what they said in your head. This is actually using a device to be able to capture and preserve those memories for future generations. And we have sound recording here. It doesn't have to be a sound recording, but for our purposes, for our oral history program, we primarily use audio devices or the audio part of an audio video interview. I want to say here too that, and I think it's down in one of the last slides you'll see, is that the Oral History Association is the national organization that oversees oral history. So, and their website is pretty easy to remember, oralhistory.org. And I think you'll see again as we get down to the bottom of these slides, there's a link to our best practices. So we very much, over the 50 plus years we've been an organization, have thought about how to do this well. And so we hope if you go forth and do these oral history interviews that you not only utilize the documents we're giving you, but also utilize the Oral Histories website. So let's, yeah, I'm going to go to the next slide. Yeah, so why is oral history important, interesting, or exciting? Well, oral history gives us the opportunity, gives each individual who sits down and does an oral history, and the person who is speaking primarily, we call in oral history parlance the narrator, because we feel like if the interviewer's done their job and done some good research and has good questions, then the person is really narrating their story to you. So oral history gives space for narrators to give their unique or individual perspectives of their memories of history. It can provide a more democratic telling of how this happened to me, because instead of reading about the leaders of not only the political leaders, but the captains of industry or maybe the sports stars, you hear from more people who didn't make the history books per se, and their stories are just as important and then could end up in the historic record if donated to an archives. Oral history is more than a questionnaire. So it's not asking just yes or no questions. So it's interesting because you actually get to hear people tell their stories, hopefully in detail. anyone can be an oral historian. Anyone can be a historian. And on the flip side, if you're giving your oral history, if you're the narrator, anyone can be a historical source. So oral history is not only a process, you learn how to do oral history, but it ends up with a product. It ends up with that primary source that Allison was talking about earlier, a primary source that other people can use. As an oral historian or as a narrator, you are the expert of your own experiences. So I'll come back here once we get through some more slides to talk specifically about how to do this project, sort of the nuts and bolts. But that's really the overview of what oral history is.
So we've got that overview. Now we're going to give you a little bit of background, a little bit of context about what's going on with energy. And a lot of you tuning in today are from Wisconsin. So we're going to start with that. And we're going to touch on a few other states as well. But I put a picture here on the right of a map of Wisconsin's energy infrastructure. And if you can tell, if you can look closely enough to see, the black dots are coal-fired power plants, blue dots are natural gas, you can tell that we've got a lot of fossil fuels going on. But I wanted to start you off by having you guess and do a little thinking for yourself. If we're talking about electricity, so no longer all of energy, we're setting aside transportation, we're setting aside heating our buildings, just thinking about electricity from now. Where does Wisconsin, what sources does Wisconsin use to make our electricity? To get you thinking, I put this little graphic down on the bottom so you can see some common sources of electricity generation. We've got solar, of course, and wind. And here are fossil fuel sources. We've got coal and natural gas. So guess in your head or guess in the chat, what do you think the biggest piece of the pie is for 2018? The biggest piece is actually coal. Coal made up about 49% of Wisconsin's electricity in 2018. That surprises a lot of people, especially young people who think automatically of solar or wind. So we've got that. What do you think is the next biggest? What about this yellow color over here? We've got some people guessing solar. Got some people guessing gas, and yeah, that's right. Natural gas is the second biggest piece of the puzzle, making about 26%. After that, we've got nuclear power, about 15%. And then finally for this green section, we've got a grouping of renewable sources. We've got wind and solar and hydropower all put together. And then lastly, this remaining 3% is other. That could be things like landfill gas or geothermal or even petroleum. So looking at this and thinking about Wisconsin, if we want to decarbonize where our electricity is coming from, if we want to use sources that don't put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, we have a lot of work to do. But things are changing. So I don't have a new fancy graph for you, but over here, if you notice, in 2019, coal-fired power plants provided 42% of Wisconsin's net electricity generation. So you can imagine changing this pie chart, taking a slice about the size of the green, the 7% here, and cutting that out of the coal. And you can add that extra onto renewables, which have been growing, and natural gas as well. So we can see that our systems are starting or are in transition. And we can see that in other ways too. If you're not into pie charts, you can look at this map and tell that things are changing. This map is from our electric grid, the Mid-Continental Independent Service Operators, its fancy name. So the electric grid is this really complicated machine that's balancing everybody who's producing power and how much and when with everybody who's using that electricity and how much and when. And so if you want to make a power plant and put more electricity onto that grid, you have to get approval. And so the website here shows you which projects are in line to get approval and which projects are being built in Wisconsin. And so you can see, if you're looking closely, these golden dots are all new solar power plants. We've got green wind farms and gray battery storage. So you can see things are changing. And if we zoom out, you can see our whole mid-continent grid. And you can see it's just exploding with new renewable projects. And if you live in these other states off to the east and the west, I imagine that it would look the same as well. There are also more ways to see that things are changing. This is an article from the New York Times that I grabbed. This was put out at the end of 2018, and it shows just some pretty fun graphics about how things are shifting. So I'm going to go through a couple states from those of you who are tuning in or who registered. So we can start with Wisconsin again. We can see similar. Coal is making up a huge piece of our puzzle. This graph goes from 2001 over here on the left, stretching year by year out to 2017. We can see as it changes year by year, we've got natural gas increasing, coal is decreasing a little, and nuclear is also decreasing. Here, this darker blue is wind starting to make more of an impact. If we look at Massachusetts, I think some of you are from Boston, you can see natural gas is the biggest piece of the puzzle here. It's been increasing as coal, this dark brown, decreases. And look at here, if you can see this yellow, solar is starting to really increase, making up 7% in 2017, swooping onto the scene. How about New Mexico? You can see coal is a giant here in New Mexico, but it too has been decreasing as the decade went on. Natural gas is increasing, taking up more. And we can see wind here at 14% in 2017 and solar. So things are shifting. California looks quite different. We don't even see coal except for this little band down here. Natural gas makes up the biggest part, but it also is decreasing here. You can see how in 2012 and 2013, wind in dark blue and solar in yellow have really soared onto the scene. North Carolina, things look different here too. Coal dramatically dropping down to 27% as nuclear and natural gas increase. A little bit of solar swooping in there too. So things are definitely shifting. We can say that, and we can see it in many different ways. Things are changing. But why? What's going on? Why are things changing? One of the reasons is purely economical. So in the last decade, wind and solar costs have decreased by 70 to 90%. Yeah, and I see someone put in the chat money. That's exactly it. So this graph is showing levelized cost of energy. That's sort of a fancy way of saying all the cost a power plant has over its useful life per unit of electricity. So you can kind of figure out what makes sense, what's expensive or not. So the units we're using are dollars per megawatt hours. A megawatt hour is 1,000 kilowatt hours, or how much you would need to power about 330 some homes for an hour. So we've got that. And if you look at the graph, we're going again from 2009 to 2018. We start out here, this yellow line is solar, and this green line is wind. Solar and wind were the most expensive for utility scale electric generation in 2009. But as the decade went on, what happened? Solar and wind are decreasing and decreasing, and all of a sudden, they are the two cheapest sources of electricity. This has been so interesting, and so many reasons for why things have changed that one of our researchers, Greg Nemeth, he wrote a whole book on it. So if you're interested in knowing what happened that made solar become so cheap, you can look there and learn more about that. But we would be really remiss if we didn't mention another reason why the electricity systems are changing. Obviously, climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change put out a really important report in 2018 that said, if we are to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the limit for avoiding the most catastrophic effects of climate change, we're going to need what they say rapid and far-reaching transitions in how we use our land and energy in our buildings, how we move around in our cities. So thinking about carbon dioxide, one of those greenhouse gases, we would need to reduce about 45% from 2010 levels by 2030, which is in 10 years, and then reaching net zero emissions by 2050. That means not putting any more into the atmosphere than we're taking out. So if we're thinking about where those carbon dioxide emissions come from, this graph over here is from the US EPA. You can see that it's a variety of different sources, transportation and agriculture, but we're thinking about right now is electricity. Our electricity systems put out about 27% of greenhouse gas emissions. So another reason why things are changing. And in addition to the scientists who are putting out these reports, I wanted to note that youth are really leading the way in a lot of the momentum for changing in response to climate change. These are all pictures, again, from Wisconsin. This is from last fall when Governor Evers and Lieutenant Governor Barnes were establishing a climate task force. And you can see some of the youth activists that were calling for action are going to be part of that task force. You can see a picture from a climate strike that happened last year in Milwaukee. And this photo is from some high schoolers in Madison who raised funds to put solar on their school's rooftop. And that inspired their entire school district to put a clean energy resolution across the district. So youth are really leading the way in a lot of this momentum and taking action against climate change. So why, given this background about things changing in energy, and why, given what you now know about oral history, why would we want to conduct an oral history about energy? The takeaway that I hope that you can leave here with is not only that things are changing, and we can see that in these graphs and these bar charts, but that the stories and the voices, the experiences of people who are living through these changes are really important. And you all have the ability to become historians and help us record this time of transition. This photo is from a really cool organization called the Great Lakes Community Conservation Corps that trains people in conservation skills like solar installations and green infrastructure. So what does it mean if our percentages of electricity generation are changing, but what do those stories look like in a community that a coal-fired power plant is being retired, or for a person who's getting a job as a solar installer? We want to hear these stories and be able to preserve them for people who are looking back at this time before 2030 when so much is going to change, and be able to kind of hear the human side of that. Okay, so here we are, the nuts and bolts section of how to conduct an oral history.
Great, thank you, Allison. First, you need to find somebody to interview. I mean, you can't do oral history without finding somebody to interview. When we started this project 2 summers ago now, it was at Grandparents University, so it was a chance for students to interview their grandparents. And grandparents can be a great possible person to interview because they have a lot of lived experience. You know, even though I said earlier that oral history can be done with anyone, including students interviewing students, grandparents, parents, aunts, uncles, they have a lot of lived experience. We also hope that if you can find somebody that has relevant experience, as you can see in that bullet point there, so somebody who's been involved in some aspect of the energy system or some aspect of advocating for or maybe against climate change too. These are the people that have relevant experience and that we hope that stories will be captured from them. They need to be willing to share. I hope that's obvious, but we put it as a bullet point because there are a lot of people who have memories or had memories, but maybe don't anymore just because the way the human brain works. So they have to be willing and also able to talk to you about the changes in energy or the changes they've seen over time. So as you can see here, the idea is, as I mentioned earlier, grandparent or an older relative, but this could also be a neighbor or a family friend. So the hope is that by doing this, you don't have to go outside of your comfort zone or go outside of your community to find somebody. And again, as we mentioned earlier, you don't have to find an expert in Washington, D.C. or in Madison, Wisconsin. Everybody or most everybody will have a story to tell. So yes, we want relevant experience, but it doesn't have to be a known name in climate change or a known name in energy system. And that's a great thing about oral history is it lets us again democratize by talking to people outside of heads of industry or leaders in fields. Okay, so choose our narrator. So next you make a plan. We really hope that if you choose to do this project and participate with us, that you meet with the person in advance without any type of recording device to explain the project and to ask permission to be interviewed. So you need to know what the project's about. So it's a good time to what we've done here today is try to give you like an elevator speech to be able if they ask you, well, why are you doing this? You can say why you're doing this. And remember that there's also an opportunity in this project to then donate it to the University Archives. So while you're doing this is hopefully not only for you or your class to learn from this, but also future generations to learn about this too. Then, practically you need to set a date and a time. Hopefully that's a time during the day. But if you're able, and they may only be able to do it in the evening, then hopefully the evening might be a time to do that. And then, we're talking to you today, students and teachers, you may decide that you just want to do this for your class. That's great. That's, we don't need it to come to the University Archives to be a part of this project. We would love it to come there. But you do need to decide fairly early on whether you want to share the interview, because then there's some other things to think about, which I think we'll get to here in a subsequent slide. Okay, so yes, the most important thing you need to do oral history is to have a good question or topic list. So let's see what your thoughts might be about this question and how to make it better. So did you ever learn about energy as a kid?
Feel free to put something in the chat if you want to, how you would rewrite that question.
And if something pops up in the chat, we certainly will address it. This is a fine. Oh, here we go.
Yeah, I'm seeing someone said this is too closed. It needs to be more open. Someone rewrote, how did you think of energy and electricity when you were young?
Yep. This is one of the number one things you need to ask in a history interview is open-ended questions. You really don't want to have a lot of closed questions. Again, this isn't a questionnaire. You can certainly give them a questionnaire in advance if you want to learn about those factual questions, but an oral history interview really excels and succeeds if we have open-ended questions that open a door, if you will, to their memory to allow them to talk in detail. So here's question number 2 about how can we make this better? So switching to 100% solar is something we all need to do right away, isn't it? So how could that question be phrased better? So this question, do you think solar energy is important? Have you thought about transitions towards renewables like solar? Both are better, much better ways to ask this. You don't want to try to put words into their mouth. You want to let them answer the question. So you try to ask a question as neutrally as possible. And this question really isn't neutral, is it? We really want them, in our mind, we want them to switch to 100% solar. So we ask the question that way. So these questions that you've dropped into chat are much better ways to ask that question than this one here. I think do we have one more? Oh,
We just wanted to note that in the activity guide, there is a list of questions, but you as the oral historians can add to that, can change that to make it your own by coming up with questions that really interest you or pertain to your narrator.
yeah, and that's really a good oral history is one that takes a guide and then makes that guide their own, by, as Allison said, crafting it so it works for your narrator, crafting it so it works for your area. And I think we have another slide that talks about, maybe making it place-based too. So yeah, interview questions are vital, but let's try to make them as open as possible and as neutral as possible. Okay. Yeah, so just some tips here. So prepare ahead of time. A good preparation makes for a better interview. You are a historian, which means historians do their research in advance. You don't just get in front of them and just read off that guide question by question, click them off, and then finish it up. You really want to be prepared ahead of time to at the very least know the questions you're going to ask, but hopefully, again, frame them so they fit the person you're interviewing or the place where you're conducting the interview. Active listening. So as I said earlier, listening is not just with your ears. You're not just hearing them waiting to speak. You're listening with your ears, with your brain, And as I said, sometimes with your eyes, nonverbal cues, and then also with your heart. Please use follow-up questions. And active listening will help you because follow-up questions do allow us to get deeper, richer stories, deeper anecdotes, and also allows them more time to reflect about a topic before you move on to a next topic. One of my favorite things to ask is, before I ask another question, is there anything else you would like to say about this topic, whatever the topic is? Let them have the last word before you move on. Be prepared to ask new questions. Yes. So the idea of being an oral historian also means being actively listening and being being present to what's happening. So they may want to talk about one aspect of energy that you don't have on your list or you haven't thought about, or they want to talk about climate change in a different way than perhaps you've thought about. So be prepared for that. And you can always ask a follow-up saying something to the effect, well, that was really interesting. I hadn't really thought about that. Is there more you want to say about that before we move on? Again, so letting them have the last word and letting them come into detail, more detail. And yes, please allow for silence. I haven't allowed for much silence in my presentation. We're trying to get through this fairly quickly, but let them sit there for a second, particularly if they stop talking and you don't think that they have fully answered the question, them think about it to decide how they want to finish answering the question. Unless they're looking at you with the look on their face saying, next question, please, or they say something like Forrest Gump and say, that's all I have to say about that, then let them have that silence before you either ask another question, or they may come back to you and ask, they may have lost their train of thoughts. They may be asking, where are we? Which is a good way to make sure that you listen well, because you are going to want to help them if they've lost their train of thought. So allowing for silence is very important. Thank you. Okay. So record in person. If you're able to record in person, use some sort of audio recorder or audio recording app. And I think we have a list of those on the guide, I think. Is that right, Allison?
Yeah.
So in person, obviously use some type of device. And then if it's remote, all of these video call systems allow you to record. I'm not sure about Google Hangout might. I've tried to record a Google Meet before and I wasn't able to, but certainly Skype and Zoom allow you to record. And then you can also just put those on speaker and then use some sort of audio recording device to record the sound that's coming out of the speaker. It's not great, but it's better than nothing. And certainly in a pandemic, every oral history interview sort of sounds like a phone call anyway. So far better than nothing. And then after that, so this is the record option on the video call. So you need to know how to use Zoom or Skype to be able to record. So get to know that if you're going to use it that way. There can be a way if you want to do an interview and you can't figure out how to use all these other systems. If you contact me, we might be able to set up, probably will be able to set up some sort of third-party calling system. What that means is that you can call in and they can call in. You two will do an interview, and then the oral history program will get a recording of that. We certainly can give you access to that recording if you need to do something for your class. And then if you donate the interview to us, we already have a copy of the audio. This hasn't been set up yet because we're just waiting to see if anybody needs or wants to take advantage of it. But my guess is it shouldn't take too long to set it up if needs be. Yeah, last thing is quiet space. So I try to ask people that I've been recording remotely to put headphones on. So they're not just shouting into their laptop or into their computer, their desktop. And then also just try to find the most quiet spot in your house at least. And then again, if you're able to, ask them, if it's remote, to find a quiet spot in their house. So the best you can do with the audio, because it is truly the most important thing, is having the conversation about our energy systems and the change in energy systems and climate change in general, if that's where you decide to go. So if you do submit your oral history to the collection, you end up with a library catalog record. This is an actual library catalog record from an interview that was done for Grandparents University for this project. So your name will be in the library at UW-Madison in their catalog. And then also what we've been doing is we've been putting these interviews online. So this is what the online record looks like. Coming through, yep, there we go. So so you can click on those chapter headings, if you will, like you could click on Saving Energy Thoughts. And if that's something you want to listen to, you could click Play Segment, and then you could listen to that, just that section of the interview. So that takes a little bit. It takes a little bit of work, but eventually any interview that comes into our collection from this project will be online, so future generations can access it from anywhere.
So we're going to skip this, but we will share the slides with you. You can access all the previous oral histories if you want to go back and listen to what other students have already done. If you do conduct an oral history interview and you have decided with your narrator that you want to submit yours to the collection, we've tried to make it as easy as possible for you to do so. There is a Google form that's linked here and also again linked in that activity guide where you can go on, just say your name, your narrator's name, the date of your interview, and upload your files. One file will be obviously your recording, and then another one that we've hinted at but haven't shown you fully yet is this release form. It's a really important form to have your signature and your narrator's signature, just to make sure that you both are okay with giving the audio recording to the library to be included in the collection for others to use. And that form is also linked in the activity guide.
And just let me say here, I've been talking narrator, but we do use the term storyteller here. So storyteller and narrator are synonymous. So the person you're interviewing for this project, if you donated to us, is called the storyteller.
Thanks, Troy. And lastly, we wanted to highlight that you can really make this project your own. We've talked about it with the questions and the narrator. If you want to make this project more specific to your community, whether your community is having a wind farm sited in your area, or a coal plant is being retired, or you want to focus on just narrators who have participated in climate marches, please feel free, go ahead and do so. One of the best advice I can remember being given in college was to think about my work as a prototype. So I'm encouraging you all in your classes to think about this oral history project as a prototype. Try something, see what works, what you learn, change it, and try it again. We are really excited to see what oral histories you all make and what you share with us and what conversations you have and what you learn from them. So please feel free to make it your own. I also wanted to note that in addition to the scientists, in addition to the politicians, youth are doing such amazing work on advocating for climate change solutions. So if you're interested in doing more about climate change, but you don't know where to start, there are so many organizations that you can join. These obviously are not all of them, just a few. When we share the slides with you, you'll be able to go on to this slide and click. They're linked to the websites of these organizations, some in Wisconsin, some worldwide. There's just a lot of really awesome projects and work that's going on. So I wanted to leave you with that as well. Another resource slide for you all. At the top, we've got that activity guide that we've mentioned throughout. We've got more information about the oral history from the Oral History Association, more information about climate change in case you're interested in learning more about that. And then we linked StoryCorps for educators here. StoryCorps is another organization that is having youth and students lead a lot of oral histories. They have a really awesome lesson that comes up every year for Thanksgiving, the Great Thanksgiving Lesson. So you can learn more and access their lesson plans there. And then I wanted to leave some space, the last 5 minutes, for some questions. And while you're typing your questions into the Q&A or the chat, just wanted to leave you with our contact information. And thank you for your time. Thanks for your attention today. Thank you in advance for the stories collect. Please feel free to reach out to either one of us with any questions or comments. You'll be directed to a survey also after you leave this webinar. So we're really appreciative for any feedback that you all have about this time with us today. And now I'm going to stop sharing my screen and so we can open up for questions. Okay, I'm looking in the chat. I see someone's asking about a timeline for submission. Timeline is up to you. We are under no deadlines for having your oral histories in, so whenever works for you and your students. Someone is asking about whether the chat will be shared and whether this recording, we will share a recording once we have access to this. We are recording this call right now and we'll share that along with the slides. I'm not sure if we'll be able to share the chat with you, but I'll pull out anything that's of importance and kind of put that in that we share out too. Any other questions or comments? I'm not seeing any more come in. Please feel free to continue typing if you're sending something in. In the meantime, I'm going to put my email again in the chat. Again, you are welcome to contact us with questions or comments throughout. And thank you again for taking the time to join us today.
Yes.
I know we threw a lot at you really fast in a short amount of time. So I expect there to be some questions that come up at some point.
Yes, thank you all for your attendance. We appreciate it.
All right, we'll hang around if anybody else has any last minute questions, but thank you again. Thanks for your feedback on our survey form, and I hope to be in contact with you all in the future. Have a good afternoon.
Yep. Bye, everybody.